All right, everybody, it is 4:05, so we can go ahead and get started. Before we do that, I just want to make sure that everyone can hear me and that everybody can see my screen right now. Awesome, we're in business. Okay, so welcome to the week 3 go-to session. This week will probably be a little bit shorter than the 2 previous weeks because we don't have quite as much stuff to go over, so that's kind of nice. We are halfway through the course, which is kind of crazy, right? The course is almost halfway over. It goes by really fast, doesn't it? Andrea says, yay, halfway through. So this week is all about peer review. So that's what we're going to be concentrating on for today's lecture. And then in week 4, you're going to work on revising your essay. So we're continuing to move through those stages of the writing process. So today we're going to talk about how we benefit from giving and receiving feedback. We'll look at a few different methods you can use to give effective feedback to your peers. And then we'll also take a look at assignment 3 in a little bit more detail. So I will ask you guys, as I'm presenting, if you can kind of hold your questions, because it's a little difficult for me to present the lecture material and keep an eye out in the chat. We do have David and Rochelle in the chat today, but I will stop periodically to see if you guys have any questions. So with all of that business out of the way, we can go ahead and get started. So I want to start by asking you guys a question, and you can use the chat box to respond. Have any of you guys done peer review in the past? In like a previous class in high school or maybe at Full Sail? Eddie says no. A couple of you are saying yes. Okay. So Eddie says yes in psychology of play and creative presentation. Good. So what kind of peer review did you do? What form did it take? Was it in a classroom? Were you paired off with another student? Jeff says it was online. Andrea also says online. Okay, so that's good. That's basically what we're going to be doing, obviously, in this class because it's an online class. It's very similar to what you would do in a classroom where you exchange a paper with another peer, but instead of doing it in the classroom, we're going to be using the discussion board for the peer review. So this week, you're going to be getting a lot of feedback on your essay. You're getting feedback from your instructors who are grading your essays, and you're also going to get feedback from each other, from your peers. And all of this feedback is going to be really helpful for you when you begin to revise your essays, because the feedback that we get from others can help us identify what we can improve in our own writing. So this week, we are going to ask ourselves this question: how effectively have we communicated our ideas? One of the most difficult things about communication and about writing in general is that ideas that seem crystal clear in our heads may not be coming across as clearly to whoever we're trying to communicate with. And peer review allows us to get those other points of view to see if we're communicating effectively. So that's kind of our overall goal this week. This is the initial step toward feedback that can help you improve your work while also helping your peers improve their work. So I want to talk about some of the benefits you get from receiving feedback. This information is important, so I don't know if you guys want to jot down some notes or take a screenshot, but it's probably going to show up on this week's check-in. So I'm just kind of giving you that heads up. So the first benefit is that you get to discover what is working in your writing, which you might not really think about when you think of peer review. You might think about, people are going to point out what's not working in your writing. And that might make you feel a little bit nervous about receiving feedback. But it's not all going to be negative. You're hopefully going to be receiving some positive feedback as well. when you're looking at each other's work, you want to be sure that you're pointing out the positive aspects of the essay. You want to comment on what's working in the essay, not just the things that need to be improved. And we'll talk about that a little bit later in more detail. Of course, another benefit is that you learn where your writing needs to improve because you're getting, these constructive ideas, feedback on your writing. You also get an objective point of view on your work. And that just means that somebody else other than you is going to be looking at your work and providing feedback. As I mentioned, you're going to be getting feedback from your instructor and also from 2 different peers. So from 3 different people this week, you'll be receiving feedback on your essay. And all of this is meant to give you that objective viewpoint on your writing. A lot of times, if we've spent a lot of time on an essay, we're too close to the writing and it's really hard to identify those areas that can be improved. And that is why we want to have other people take a look at it. So another benefit is that receiving feedback helps you identify those mistakes you can't see. As I kind of just mentioned, it can be difficult to catch errors when you've spent so much time staring at this piece of paper. Hold on one second. Harold's saying he's having audio problems. Is anybody else having any audio problems? Okay, Professor Fox is saying no. Okay, so Harold, what I'd suggest is signing out of GoToMeeting and signing back in again because it might be a problem on your end. Okay? Okay, so let's see, where was I? Okay, so this is where that objective viewpoint can really help you by helping you find those errors that you can't really see on your own. Feedback also helps you improve on areas you struggle with. For example, let's say that you are having a hard time connecting the ideas in your first paragraph with the ideas in your second paragraph, and you just feel stuck and you're not sure how to fix that. Your instructor or maybe one of your peers might offer a suggestion on how you can better connect those ideas using a transitional phrase. So their suggestion might help you look at the problem in a completely different way that you didn't initially think about. You also learn to accept constructive criticism when you receive feedback. And this is a huge one, something that you definitely want to practice. I often hear from students that they are nervous about peer review. In the check-in for week 1, there was that question that asked, what are you excited about in the class? What are you nervous about? And some students said that peer review is what they were most nervous about. I know it can be difficult to have someone else look at your work and point out the areas that are not working. But this is something that you're going to experience a lot, not just at Full Sail, but also in your career after you've graduated. You're going to have bosses and colleagues that offer constructive criticism on your work. So it's important to get comfortable with listening to the ideas and opinions of others. And then lastly, you get to practice applying the feedback to make your work better. So you're going to take all of this feedback you've gotten and you're going to use it to improve your essay. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about assignment 3. Keep in mind that there are 2 due dates for this assignment. One is for the initial post, and then the other one is for the 2 peer response posts. So I want you to be sure to check the assignment instructions on FSO to make sure you are meeting those deadlines to avoid losing points. So I want to talk about the requirements for that first post for those of you who haven't done it yet. So the first part of the assignment is to post your essay to the discussion board, but that's not all you have to post. You also need to include the answers to some self-reflection questions. And you can find those questions in the assignment instructions for assignment 3. So let's take a look so you know exactly where to find them. So these are the instructions for assignment 3. And if you go down to page 3, you'll see these self-reflection questions. So along with your essay, you also want to post the answer to these questions on the discussion board. If you haven't done this yet, What you want to do is copy and paste the text of your essay directly into your post, followed by the answers to the questions right after that. Do not post your essay as a file or a link, because it's going to make it more difficult for your peers to access it. And if your peers are going through the discussion board looking for something to comment on, if yours is a download, they're probably going to skip right over it and go to the next one that's just right there on the discussion board. So please just copy paste right onto the discussion board. You do not need to include a title page, just the body of your document. You also do not need to worry too much about formatting, like double spacing or indenting the references list. FSO has a tendency to kind of mess up the formatting, so we're not really going to look for those things, but you do need to include your references list. Okay, so the information that's on your references list. So when you guys are giving feedback, and we'll go into this in more detail, what we want you to be looking for, but because we can't really ask you to, on FSO, get the formatting correct because it doesn't really like formatting, we're not going to ask you to comment on each other's APA style. Okay, leave that to your instructors. Okay, so as I mentioned, you have to answer these self-reflection questions, and make sure that you're taking time to really reflect on them and to think about your answers, okay? So for example, the first question, which parts of your essay do you feel most closely meet the expectations for exemplary writing as described in the essay rubric, and why? Be specific. So notice here that this question is asking you to go to the essay rubric, which is the rubric for assignment 2, and refer back to it in this question. So if you don't mention it, you're not going to be completely answering the question. So a lot of times students, well, not a lot of times, but sometimes students will, instead of looking at the rubric for assignment 2, they'll accidentally look at the rubric for assignment 3. You want to make sure that you're comparing it to information in the rubric for assignment 2. Okay, so that can be found under assignment 2. You guys will just click on it. For me, I preview it. And you go down to the download section, and the rubric is right there. Okay, so that's where you can find the rubric to answer that question. Hopefully you guys have already seen that rubric because you've already turned in that assignment. And hopefully you've been looking at your rubrics throughout the class, because they're very useful tools that can let you know exactly what you need to do in order to perform well on your assignments. But anyway, it's there for you. So the other questions, which parts of your essay could use improvement, and why? Be specific. Remember to include the why part. Identify at least 2 parts of your essay you feel need improvement, and ask your peers specific questions about those parts. I'm not going to read all through this for you, but there's examples of a specific question and examples of a non-specific question. So make sure that you kind of read these examples when you're crafting your question that you're going to ask your peers. Okay, so that's what assignment 3 is. Initial post, your essay with these self-reflection questions, and then the follow-up part is going to be your peer responses, which we're going to get into in more detail. So let's get back into the keynote. So we already talked about how you can benefit from receiving feedback, but there are also benefits from giving feedback to others. Again, you might want to jot down some notes or take a screenshot, because you are going to see this material again soon. So the first benefit is that you get to practice applying the writing and critical thinking skills you have learned to assess the quality of written text. As an instructor, I have to give constructive feedback all the time. That's part of my job. So I get a lot of practice with critical thinking skills every time I grade a paper. Every essay is new and different, and it's a unique challenge. And I actually can learn a lot from grading the essays. So for example, if I see a really well-written submission, I can look at what's working and why. Maybe I see that a lot of you are doing well with organization in your essays, and that tells me that we did a really good job of covering that topic in the lecture. On the other hand, maybe I see that a lot of you are struggling with organization. That shows me that I may need to devote more time talking about organization in the lecture. So when it comes to giving feedback, it's really a give and take. You give feedback to help your peers, but you're also learning something from giving the feedback. For you guys, you're probably going to be learning something about the essay and how to apply, changes that are needed in your own essay, because you're going to be seeing a lot of different examples of your peers' writing. So you also benefit by learning how to recognize what is working and what needs improvement in a piece of writing. Sometimes it can be really hard to see these things in our own work. But when you're looking at somebody else's essay, you have that objective viewpoint that we talked about earlier. And this means it can be a lot easier to identify those issues because you're looking at somebody else's paper. So that will then give you practice being more critical with your own work. This kind of leads into the next benefit, which is that you strengthen your ability to recognize errors in your own work by pointing them out in the work of others. You also identify what you value in writing. So when you're responding to another's work, you're actually learning about your own values and what you find most important and most crucial in a piece of writing. Say, for example, you're reading your peer's essay and they have a lot of really good information from their sources, but their ideas are kind of unorganized and it's really hard for you to follow their train of thought. That kind of shows you that organization is really important and that's something that you value in writing. Lastly, you get to develop critiquing skills by practicing constructive criticism. So we talked about how we have to get used to accepting constructive criticism and applying it, but we also need to practice giving constructive criticism because we're going to be in positions at Full Sail and in our careers where we're going to have to do that. Okay, so the second part of assignment 3, as I mentioned, is commenting on 2 of your peers' essays. So we're going to look at some different methods for how to do that. Before we jump into that stuff, does anybody have any questions about what we've talked about so far? You guys are good? Okay, awesome. So before we get into those specific methods for peer review, I want to talk about the difference between global issues and local issues, because this is really going to help you when it comes time to deciding what to look for in your peers' writing. Again, this is stuff that you might see on the check-in this week. So first we're going to look at global issues. When we say global issues, we're not talking about problems you hear about on the news, like world hunger or global warming. And it's always, I can tell who watches the lecture because it's always the ones that don't watch the lecture who answer this quiz question like that. They'll say it's global warming or no, that's not what we're looking for. We're talking about global issues that are specific to writing. So you might also hear them called big picture issues or higher order issues, but it's the same thing. Basically, these are things that affect your paper as a whole. So these are issues with focus, development, organization, and then general problems with style and tone. So when you are giving feedback to your peers, we want you to start with global issues. And I want to kind of give you some examples of that. So with focus, you want to look at the essay and see if it's focused from beginning to end. In this case, for this assignment, has your peer focused on one role model? Has your peer focused on job-related obstacles and specific strategies that that role model used to overcome those obstacles? Has your peer discussed how they can use what they've learned about perseverance in their future career? If they have a lot of information in their essay that is just biographical, that doesn't have anything to do with problems or perseverance strategies, or maybe they have a lot of information about the role model's successes, that stuff is kind of off topic, so it's not in focus with the paper. So that's something to look out for when you're looking at their focus. And with development, have they offered enough specific detail from their research to support their ideas? Is there enough detail overall? Do you understand what they're saying, or is it kind of hard to decipher what they're saying because they haven't included enough detail? That's the sort of thing you want to look for with development. When looking at organization, do the ideas seem to flow naturally? Do ideas seem connected, or are there ideas that seem out of place? Does each paragraph discuss one main idea? Remember that we want each paragraph in the paper to have one main idea, and each sentence in each paragraph should support that main idea. So if you have one paragraph and it's talking about 3 different main ideas, there's some organization issues in that paper. And you also want to look for overall issues with style and tone. Maybe the writing is too informal for an academic essay. It might be a little bit harder for you guys to determine this because you might not be aware of who your peers' audience is. But if you're looking through the paper and you notice that, in half the paper it's very formal, and then all of a sudden it's very informal and using words that you wouldn't, think to use for a specific audience, if you see that it's not consistent, that might be something that you want to point out when you're giving feedback. So the big thing to remember here is that global issues are what we want to address first when we're giving feedback. So if your peer hasn't discussed peer perseverance at all, obviously that's going to be one of the big things that you want to mention first. Or maybe they have discussed perseverance, but the essay does not feel organized. That's something that you're also going to want to point out first. You always want to focus on these global issues. So the other type of issue is the local issue, also known as small picture or lower order issues. And these are things like grammar, mechanics, spelling, capitalization, word choice, and typos. When I say lower order, I don't mean that these things are not important. They are absolutely important. I just mean that they are the last things we focus on when we are looking at our peers' writing, or they're the last things we should focus on. If there are large portions of the assignment that need to be improved, then it doesn't make sense to focus on these local issues. So we notice that when students write peer reviews, they kind of tend to talk about the lower order concerns like grammar, spelling, and punctuation, because it sometimes feels safer, especially if they're not really comfortable with how to talk about global issues. But we kind of want you to push past that comfort level a little bit. We really want you to focus on the big picture issues in your peer review, because this is really what is going to help your peers improve their essays. Now, that's not to say that you can't mention local issues, but if you do mention them, I'm going to look to see that you have thoroughly addressed all the global issues first. Okay. So we looked at the difference between global and local issues. We know that you want to discuss global issues in your peers' writing. You want to focus on those. Now we're going to look at a specific method for commenting on your peers' writing. It's called the RISE model. You guys, I know, have heard about it in another class. If you've taken creative presentation, you've had some experience using the RISE model. We did ask you to use the RISE model in your week 1 assignment peer responses. I didn't see too many students using it, so I think it's a good idea for us to go over it in a little bit more detail, because it's really going to help you with this week's peer responses. So, RISE is an acronym that stands for reflect, inquire, suggest, and elevate, and each of the words stands for one step in the model. Okay, so the first step is to reflect, or to recall, ponder, and communicate. So basically, the reflect step, you guys are often pretty good at doing this. You are able to read what your peers have written, to reflect on it, and to comment on it. Okay, so maybe something like, I relate, concur, disagree with this because, or I like what you did here because. Okay, but if you're stopping here and you're not moving past this stage, you're not fully utilizing the RISE model. Beyond reflecting, you also want to inquire. Seek information and or provide ideas through questioning. So have you considered looking at this from another perspective? Or when you said this, am I understanding you to mean that? So this is a great time to ask questions if you think something in their writing is unclear or you're not sure about. The next step is to make suggestions. We've acknowledged what our peer has written, we've asked some questions, and now we're ready to make some suggestions. So we want to introduce ideas for improvement here, and we want to be specific when we do that. For example, you might consider tweaking X for Y effect, or you might want to include supporting information from this resource. Here's a link. This is where students can sometimes be a little bit timid because maybe you're afraid to hurt your peers' feelings. So you might have a tendency to say a lot of positive things about their work and then completely skip over the suggestions for improvement. But if you only have positive things to say about their writing, then you're not really giving them any guidance they can use to improve it. In a little bit, we'll talk a little bit more about how to phrase criticism in a supportive tone so that you start to feel a little bit more comfortable making these types of suggestions. The final step is to elevate. Okay, this is where we take the constructive notes that we've given and we offer potential solutions. So we raise to a higher degree or purpose in future iterations. For example, perhaps you can expand this in X capacity to further address Y, or perhaps you can repurpose X as Y for Z. So in the suggest phase, we pointed out some of the issues, and now in the elevate phase, we're making suggestions on how those issues can be fixed. Or maybe we see an opportunity there, well, I think this would be a great source for you to look into for more ideas on this. Or have you considered this aspect of his career? This might be something interesting to look into. So you're elevating it to another level. So the RISE model is one method you can use when you're commenting. You can also use the compliment sandwich. Our overall goal is to offer constructive feedback, but doing so can sometimes come off a little bit harshly. So we can use this method called the compliment sandwich to kind of soften that feedback. And this is how it works. Okay, so the first step is to compliment the writer on what is working in the paper. I really like this aspect of your essay because. The next step is to include a suggestion for revision. However, you could fix this area in this way to make it stronger. And then finishing with another compliment. Overall, this was an interesting piece because. Now, the thing to be careful about with the compliment sandwich, well, actually, there's a couple things. The first is that we're not just making generic compliments, okay? We actually want to look for what's working in the essay and offer genuine compliments. For example, it would not be very genuine to say, I really loved your essay, then mention 10 things that are wrong with it, and then end with, that was a great essay. Right? Because that's insincere, and you haven't really told them what you loved about the essay or what was working about the essay. There's always something that's working well in the essay. Maybe a student has a really great example of a job-related obstacle. That would be something you could compliment. Or maybe, their focus is a little bit off, but they have pretty good structure and organization in the paper. You could comment on the organization. The idea is that we're softening our suggestions, but we're not being insincere in the process. The other thing to be aware of, and this is a big one that I see students doing, the compliment sandwich is not something that we just do once and call it a day, okay? So you're not just going to, give one compliment, one suggestion, end with a compliment, and piece you're out of that peer response. No, that's not going to cut it, okay? We want to offer more than one suggestion. So the compliment sandwich is something you can use over and over again within your piece of peer response to comment on multiple issues and multiple things that are working in the paper. So this is a process that can be repeated as you're looking for various issues. Now you can also use this in combination with the RISE model, okay? There's one last method, describe, explain, advise. It's kind of similar to the RISE model. First, we describe the issue in detail. Let's see if there's an example here now. Okay, so in some ways, the describe step is similar to the reflect step. We're acknowledging what's on the page and we're describing it. Then we move on to the higher level, which is to explain why it's a problem. And then in the last step, which is similar to the elevate step in the RISE model, we're giving suggestions on how to fix the problem, okay? So describe the problem, explain why it's a problem, and offer suggestions on how to fix the problem. So those are 3 methods for giving feedback: the RISE model, the compliment sandwich, and describe, explain, advise. They're kind of similar. You can use a combination of all these, or you can stick to the RISE model. I can't speak for the other instructors, but for me, the important thing is that you're putting your best effort toward your peer reviews, that you're being very specific in your responses, and that you're sincerely trying to help your peers. So if you're going onto the peer discussion board and you're leaving 2 sentences, that is not enough, right? That's not enough to really help your peers. So you want to really make sure that you're using these 3 models to give effective feedback. And this actually leads me to a question that I want to ask you guys. For those of you who have done peer feedback in the past, which I know several of you have, I want you to think about what was helpful when it came to peer feedback as opposed to what was not helpful. Let's start with what was not helpful. What type of comments would you not want to see when you're getting peer feedback? What sort of feedback is unhelpful? Anybody have any ideas? Yep, Jeff says people just saying they like it and that's it. Exactly. So, maybe they started with that first step in the RISE model, but then they never moved past that step. Eddie says negative comments. Yeah, I mean, certainly anything that's like a personal negative attack you wouldn't want, right? Like Tim is saying, yeah, you wouldn't want to see that. But I mean, some comments are going to be constructive. They're going to point out areas that you can improve. So I wouldn't see those really as negative comments. They're actually comments that are meant to help you bring your paper up to the next level. But yeah, certainly you want to avoid any kind of personal attacks. Someone pointing out a problem but not giving a suggestion on how to fix it. Exactly. So, they might make you aware of the problem, but if you really didn't know how to fix it to begin with, you might still feel stuck. Jeff has said that's kind of how he's gotten feedback in the past. He's had no helpful critiquing from classmates. Yeah, that can be a struggle. Hopefully in this class you will get some more effective feedback because we are spending so much time talking about how to give feedback. So I'm hoping to see that turnaround for you. Wyatt agrees. Jeff says, I want people to be honest and blunt. Yeah. And as we mentioned, sometimes people are kind of afraid to hurt feelings. But it's really not helpful just to give all positive feedback. We need to also know what to work on. So some other things that I have heard from students in the past, you guys have kind of touched on these. So being too general, being too friendly, not pointing out issues. Another big one that we haven't brought up yet is getting caught up in the topic instead of the writing itself. I saw this a lot with the peer feedback from assignment 1. You guys would really get caught up with, oh, I love that artist or I love that musician. And then the entire post would be focusing on that person instead of focusing on the writing and how your peer can improve the writing. So that's something that you want to think about when you're leaving feedback on this assignment. So we talked about feedback that isn't helpful, and now I want to look at some feedback that is effective. In other words, what makes for quality feedback. Again, this slide is important, so take some notes. Good feedback is specific. So whether we're pointing out things that are working well or things that need improvement, we want to be specific. So let's say that an essay you're reading has issues with organization. Saying the essay is not organized, that's not specific and it's not quality feedback. It points out the problem, but it does not show the writer where the problem is. So instead, saying something like, I noticed some sentences in your first paragraph don't seem to support the main idea in that paragraph. Is there another paragraph where those sentences might work better? You might try incorporating them into the second paragraph to improve organization in the paper. That's a lot more specific. It points out the problem, it shows the writer where the problem is, and it offers a suggestion for improvement. So that's what we mean by being specific. Obviously, feedback should be helpful. That should be our whole goal in giving feedback, is we're trying to help our peers with their writing. It should also be considerate. Remember that online communication is different from real-world communication. Online, we can't convey tone of voice at all. So it's important to kind of be sensitive about how we phrase things, and that's why, we talked about using that compliment sandwich. However, there is a difference between being considerate when providing suggestions and being nice because we're too timid to point out issues in a paper. Being considerate does not mean failing to provide suggestions for improvement. We want to avoid being too harsh. Good feedback is not just about pointing out problems. We talked about making sure that we're mentioning what's working in the paper as well as what can be improved. Again, it's harder to convey tone online, so you might think that your suggestion is coming off to a reader in one way and they might be reading it another way, so be cautious about that. Quality feedback also points out what works and what needs improvement. We talked about that a lot. And quality feedback speaks to the writer and about the piece of writing. So you might have noticed back in that first discussion assignment, I kind of mentioned this briefly, but some students would focus on the topic instead of talking about the writing itself. So people really like to talk about topics. So maybe they say things like, oh, you chose Kendrick. He's my favorite rapper. Or you chose Taylor Swift. I've been to 7 of her shows. She's awesome. Okay, that's great. But it's all about how much you love Kendrick or Taylor and nothing about the writing, nothing that helps your peer. So our job is to write about the quality of the writing that's been posted, not the topic of the writing. All right, the last thing that I want to talk about today before we open the floor up, oh no, I went too fast. Before we open up the floor for questions is the fact that effective feedback takes time. I suggest that you're reading through each essay a few times. Read through it once to get an idea of what it's about, and then read through it a second time, maybe a third time, to look for what's working and to look for what can be improved. A good rule of thumb is to spend 1 hour per peer review. So if you're spending 5 minutes reading the essay and 5 minutes commenting on it, you're not really doing peer review effectively. You want to devote some time to it. And we can totally tell if you guys have taken the time with your peer review. Also, you want to be sure to proofread that feedback that you're leaving, because you are leaving it in a discussion post. Sometimes it can be easy to let those grammar mistakes slip by. A good rule of thumb is to type up your peer review responses in Word and then copy and paste it into the discussion board. That can help you catch a lot of those mistakes. Keep in mind that all the writing that you do at Full Sail should be professional, and this includes the discussion boards, peer response posts, messages to your instructor, and of course your formal assignments. Discussion boards, even though they might be a little bit more informal than an essay, they're not YouTube comment sections. It's not a Reddit thread. It's not a Facebook wall. It's still, you still need to communicate professionally in the course with your peers. So keep that in mind. Also, if you notice that one of your peers has a ton of responses, maybe they're one of the first peers to post, so they've already had a lot of students replying to them, try and move down the list and give attention to someone who hasn't gotten as much feedback. And this will help make sure that everyone in the class gets at least 2 responses so that you all get that helpful feedback that you're going to need to revise your paper in week 4. All right, so we've talked about a lot today. That's all the content that I have for you. So we have time for questions. Do you guys have any questions about what we've covered this week or about this week's assignments or about anything? If you guys don't have questions, you can also feel free to go about the rest of your Monday. If you do have questions, raise your hand or type in the chat. Awesome, Jeff and Eddie are good. Thank you, Jeff. I appreciate that. You're welcome, Daniel. Bye, Eric. I'll wait a few more minutes just in case anybody's typing out a question. I'm not sure what you're saying, Wyatt, but okay. Oh, okay. I got that it was German. I didn't know what exactly you were saying. But you're welcome. You guys are using everything except for English. Wow, that's cool. I mean, not cool that English is hard for you, but it's kind of cool that German is your first language. And Eddie says Spanish is his first language. Yeah, it can definitely be a challenge to think in a different language, to write in a different language. Bye, Wyatt. You're right, Jeff. Jeff says English is the hardest language because we have a million meanings for one word. Totally. All right, I'm going to hang out for a little bit longer, but I am going to stop the recording since we don't really seem to have